So now we get more into Greek thought. Okay, what I said last time was just about how Greece happened to become important in the Mediterranean. And of course, I assume you know that these thinkers are important not only because they had powerful ideas, but because Greece had a huge influence over the Mediterranean, and eventually, thanks to Alexander's conquest of what today is the Middle East, it spread, over a large area of the civilized world. So Greek philosophy comes out at some point with a number of defining characteristics. First of all, a belief that the universe must make sense. Today we still live in that world. I mean, scientists are trying to find the theory of everything. Scientists are trying to find the equation of this or that fundamental force. The belief is the universe makes sense. It's not like there's somebody playing dice, just to quote Einstein, misquote Einstein. And we can make sense of it. We can find out what that regularity is. Which also implies there must be something that is the fundamental substance of the world. And I'm using sort of modern contemporary terms. We are looking for the fundamental forces. We are looking for the fundamental particles. So we're still in that kind of mindset. And of course, for them, there were four suspects: fire, air, water, and the earth. So different philosophers had different ideas, but those were the four fundamental entities that they discussed. And then one important thing was change. I mean, believe it or not, this is me a few years ago. So these and these are the same, but they're not. So something remains the same, something is not. And so what has changed when we say something changed? Okay, so that became the big. Those became the big questions that the Greek philosophers tried to answer for a long time. And I want to remind everybody that Greece in those days was not just this. Today Greece ends here. This is Macedonia, and this is part of Turkey today. Okay? But actually, Greece was really this. And Greek philosophy is born actually here, which is now Turkey. Lots of arguments and wars between Greece and Turkey because of this island and this part that the Greeks say that's our homeland. So this gentleman has the reputation of being the first philosopher. He is the one who started this discussion and some other discussions. But we don't have any text. We just know from other people. But that town also gave us other philosophers, and I know we know more about them, and I will go quickly through this school and some other schools. The previous slide. Yeah, so eventually Greece also extends to southern Italy. Magna Graecia, that's here, the southern Italy, Sicily, Naples. So Anaximander is another member of that school, and he thought that there's got to be a substance that is not fire, air, wind, whatever. It's got to be something that we never discovered, and he called it apeiron. And you can see it as I use the symbol of the infinite just to give the idea that it's something that we can't express, and that's the thing that generates eventually the four fundamental elements. He also the theory of evolution is actually very old. Darwin is very important because he gave us a scientific theory of evolution. But the theory that animals evolved is actually very old, and I mention it here just because it's one of the many. There's been many predecessors of Darwin. Darwin is the one who actually gave us a scientific theory. The Earth is floating in the vacuum. This was also sort of revolutionary, and he mentioned it was like that, and he had his own map and so on. Um, Xenophon had also interesting, I mean, I point out only what is interesting from my modern point of view about these philosophers. So there is only one God. Again, how can you say there is only one God in a place where there's an official hierarchy of gods? Well, again, the big advantage there is that there was no dogma. So he could have his own opinion that we created those gods, the gods of the Olympic gods, in our own image, and we created them. And then a strong belief in wisdom and knowledge. Oh, by the way, I Googled, this is I put it today, I Googled, I mean, who do you find if you Google Xenophon of Colophon? Well, you find that this lady, who actually has a very nice article on, maybe that's what I should do to get people's attention. She has actually a very professional article on this philosopher, but also her picture in a bikini. Actually, I highly recommend the article. It's really well written. So then there was also a part of Greece in southern Italy, and that was also very important. I think I already wrote, yeah, some of the philosophers came from here, Parmenides, Zeno, Pythagoras, I'm sure you know Pythagoras, and Archimedes from Sicily. So that part, we always say Greek philosopher, Greek, thinker, but sometimes it's not really what today is Greece. So Pythagoras is the first of this quartet, and I assume you remember Pythagoras' theorem, which we're not sure that everything we attribute to him was really to him. He had the whole school movement followers, and those followers are also interesting because they realized that the connection between mathematics and music, and in general about mathematics and the order of the universe. So that eventually became what today we would call a religious cult, where it became very spiritual actually. Nowadays we tend to think of mathematics as part of engineering, as laying the foundation for science. But with that school actually led to a very spiritual approach to thinking about the universe. Yeah, so today I still find things like this, how Plato and Pythagoras can save your life. So, you can find a lot of references still to the philosophy of Pythagoras because it starts from mathematics, but then it becomes very spiritual. From the point of view of mathematics, that school is important because Pythagoras' theorem has an interesting implication. If the two sides of the triangle are 3 and 4, it's easy to calculate this number. I don't know if you remember the formula, but it's easy, that's fine. Okay? But if the two sides are 1 and 1, for example, what's the number here? It's the square root of 2. What number is that? It's not 1, it's not 2, it's not 3. So they realized there are numbers beyond what we call the natural numbers, beyond 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This has a length, but it is not 1, it is not 2, it's something in between. Even worse, some of these numbers, you can't write them. You go on and on and on and on forever. So they realized something important from the point of view of mathematics. And that's just the beginning of Greek mathematics. Okay. Lots of things will happen. Eventually Euclid's geometry. So lots of progress in calculating things. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, Thales introduced the discussion on change. And Heracletus is probably the most famous of the people who discuss change. These are two pictures I took of the same place by accident, from the same angle, to two different years, you can also tell probably two different, maybe it's a cloud or maybe it's later in the day. But you can tell this is the same place. But it's not, actually. Why it is not? Because the atoms that were here are not here. Okay, there's water that came with the rain, with the snow melting, whatever, that was not here. So he's the one who said that you can never enter the river twice. Because when you enter the second time, it's a different river. The water is different. Okay? The water flows away. When you enter the second time, you're entering something different. But the river has the same name. And today we go beyond that. You cannot enter the same river twice, also because the second time you have changed. Are you still you? Am I still that child? Okay. So he's the one who famously discussed this. What's identity? This is called Darwin Canyon. If you want to hike there, it's a long hike. So what defines Darwin's Canyon? Just the picture, the shape, you know. And then he also discussed a little bit. So the Greeks were very confusing when it comes to mind. They did discuss mind. The philosophical discussion on mind started with Descartes eventually in Europe and becomes the mind-body problem that we still discuss today. So the Greeks did discuss that a little bit, but for us that it's confusing because they use different terms. So he discussed body and soul, and he used the term soma and psyche. And but then he said there's intellect. I don't know how else to translate logos that permeates the universe, and everything comes from this logos. So, and we will see that that's still true with Plato, Aristotle, Aristoteles. I tend to use the Greek names. That for us it's a little confusing because they use different terms to talk about the soul, psychology, mind, intellect, and so on. But it's interesting, this is another philosopher who believed that, okay, you can talk about gods if you want, all those gods of the Homeric poems, but at the end of the day, what really exists out there is logos and permeates everything. Another guy from southern Italy, and he held the opposite view. Nothing ever changes. Change is an illusion. And of course, people who are well versed in Buddhism find similarities between his view and Buddha's views. Reality is eternal, and we just have the illusion of change, the illusion of fragmentation of the world. The world is actually just one. We're all interconnected. It's all just one big thing, and it's just our mind is not big enough to comprehend it. What I want to do, of course, I don't want you to remember all of this. I want to give an idea of the breadth of Greek philosophy in those very few centuries. Zeno is also interesting. You know, talking about change and movement and so on, he proved logically that I can never pass the slowest animal you can think of. Think of the tortoise or think of the snake. You know, as long as that very slow animal has a head start, it's impossible to pass it. It's impossible to overtake the tortoise. Okay, the animal starts from there. Oh, let's give you more attention so I can make it a little clear. It starts from there, right? He says, Zeno says, by the time I reach the point where the animal is moved, right? By the time I reach the point where the animal is now, the animal is moved, right? By the time I reach, I get closer and closer and closer. But if you just do it step by step, by the time I reach the point where the animal will be a little bit further up. And yes, it becomes closer. But you can continue this argument forever. Yes, I get 1 millimeter from the animal, but by that time the animal is moved 1/10 of a millimeter ahead, and so on and so on and so on. So how does it happen that actually in reality we overtake? It took 23 centuries for somebody to give an answer, and we are still not sure it's actually the right answer. We all know it happens, we all know faster things overtake slower things. But actually, Zeno had a very good point. Logically speaking, you cannot do that. And there's three of these paradoxes, if you're curious. And all three eventually have to do with movement. So lots of logic also. This starts probably with Parmenides. Eventually, it's not just opinions. It's not just, oh, I think everything is water. No, these are people increasingly try to use logic to explain the universe. This is the first openly atheistic philosopher, and is also probably the first one to introduce the concept of atoms, although the term was coined by the more famous Democritus. And he also believed that something that pervades the universe is called the nous. Again, terminology gets confusing, and I hate to use English words because then you simplify everything by saying mind, but they use different words. Okay? So this nous pervades the universe. And the other thing, he's the first one to advance the theory of panspermia to explain the original life on Earth. Panspermia is the idea that it came from somewhere else, from space. Still a valid theory. Still distinguished NASA scientists who think that's a possibility. Well, he mentioned it first. Then there were the Sophists. Anybody, if you have friends called Sophia, remind them that Sophia means wisdom in Greek. So the Sophists were wise people. They were nomadic. They would travel from town to town and have discussions on things with people. And they were very influential. It was a new kind of philosopher. Of the other ones, we know very little of their life. Of these ones, we know they walked a lot. And whether the other ones also walked a lot, probably never know. So,
quick question.
Sure.
So, were the Greek philosophers like an elite part of society, or was it also just part of the culture at the time to question? Like, were people in the middle class also having discussions and engaging in philosophical?
Well, the first thing is hard to define what the middle class was back then.
Okay.
But they were relatively ordinary people from that point of view. And we actually have no evidence that they knew how to read and write, because we learn a lot about them from Plato, Aristotle, 2 centuries later. So it's hard to answer the question. But they were not only aristocrats, if that's the question. Okay, and the most famous of these guys is Pythagoras, another one who didn't have strong religious views. And it's interesting, with these guys, you start seeing the transition that becomes bigger with Socrates. Socrates, is the next one. So what happens with Socrates and with the Sophists? So far, all of those other philosophers, there's many more, by the way. I just mentioned random sample. I knew if I gave you more than 10, it would be just overwhelming. So all these other philosophers were really doing what today we call metaphysics. They were trying to explain the universe. There's got to be some ultimate explanation why the universe is what it is, and why we're here, and so forth. And we know only probably a fragment of what they discussed when they met. Okay, but that was that. With Socrates and the Sophists, what happens? Philosophy really changes to focus on you, on how should you live your life. That's a major change in the discussion. Yeah, by the way, Socrates is a good example. He didn't leave us anything written. We're pretty sure he did not write anything, and he's just a character in the most famous dialogues of all time. Plato wrote dialogues, and in those dialogues, there's consistently Socrates saying something. We have to trust that Plato is telling us the truth about Socrates. So if it was a philosophy of men, it was a philosophy of the ordinary person. And so it was moral. It was a moral philosophy is born here. Very different from from the first century and a half. So the first thinker. Those statues are in downtown Athens, and they're very modern, but it's a good idea to show him thinking. So it's all about virtue, wisdom. It's not about finding out which thing is true, but what is truth. It's about the big questions, in a sense, about our life and living in a society. So philosophy becomes a guide to living your life. Philosophy is a way of life, and therefore philosophy starts with ethics, with moral values. So there's a change with Socrates. Not so much a change, but a new kind of philosophy. The other philosophy remains. I mean, Plato and especially Aristotle are very much in the mainstream of what had come before. But with Socrates, you also have to add a component. That's the moral, personal component. Meanwhile, this is a philosopher who comes from the north of Greece and didn't give us many philosophers. And he's the one who's famous for coining the term Atomos. And so he's the one that usually we associate with the theory, the atomic theory. He thought everything is made of some very small, indivisible units. He called them atoms. And so everything is built out of atoms. Now, as I was saying, one thing, this slide was made originally for a younger crowd. One thing that is confusing about all of these philosophers for us is that they use these terms from psyche, logos, nous, timos, and pneuma, which are to express. We tend to translate nous as intellect. Nous as intellect, but then what is logos? But that's also intellect. Logic comes from logos. Psyche we tend to translate it with mind, but nous is also mind in many of these discussions. Pneuma, it's the fact that we are breathing, that we are alive, but it's not. Usually, it's not a physical thing. It's more like a psychological thing. Timos, which is one of my favorites, is even more difficult to express. But we all have timos, and it's very important. It's something that drives our lives. So the Greeks for us can be a little confusing, because when it comes to psychology, to philosophy of mind, because you should really use the original word as opposed to just translating all of those words as mind. Okay, the two big ones. Plato and Aristotle, in a sense, totally different view of the world. Aristotle was a big believer in the senses. Okay? There's a world out there, we have senses to perceive the world, and with that we can figure out what's out there. Plato is exactly the opposite. The senses confuse you, and actually you will never know the truth. The truth is not accessible by the senses. All we can see is just shadows of reality. Two completely different views of the world. Now, obviously they both were very influential. Aristotle would be very influential in science, because he tells us you have to use the senses, you have to explore the world, and what your senses tell you is true. You just have to be smart enough to understand what the senses are saying. Plato is the opposite. He tells us you will never know exactly what's out there. You only know what your senses tell you, and that's not what is out there. And that will also be still true to today. You know, what's out there according to quantum mechanics, not objects and people. There's particles and waves. So both will last until today. Very different the way they wrote their theories. Plato is all about these dialogues between probably imaginary dialogues between Socrates and various people. So he also invented a new literary form. Aristotle really creates the idea of the scientific philosophical treatise, of the essay, of the, there's something on logic, there's something on science, there's something on psychology. And in fact, to this day, we tend to divide human knowledge based on the categories that his writings invented, basically. So two different, really different approaches to philosophy and two different ideas of philosophy. So he thinks what we know about the world is basically, this is a picture I took. It's actually a bigger picture. I was on the mountains. I took a picture of this forest, and this is me actually. The sun was behind me. This is my shadow. So he says, all we can know is this. I see a shadow of me out there, and the rest is also all shadows. So his most famous metaphor is the cave. You are in a cave, you can't see very well, and what you see is just these shadows, blurred things. Yes, they have some connection with reality, but you can never grasp reality as it is. So what is reality, the ultimate reality? He called it eidos, and some people translate it as ideas, some people translate the word as forms. These are things that are eternal, they always existed, they will always exist, they have their own world, there's a world of ideas, and we can connect with those ideas, but the ideas pre-existed. Knowledge is remembering innate knowledge, anamnesis. So what really exists is those ideas, and we will never completely grasp what is out there. And so, of course, that also implies that there's a part of us that is the idea of us, and that, just like any idea, is eternal. And the body, instead, is the part that is limited and is mortal. And of course, this, which is a footnote in Plato's philosophy, will become a big thing later on. The idea that there's an immortal soul and a mortal body, a divine soul and a material body. And the soul, very important actually, the soul grows. You can educate the soul. So not surprisingly, with Plato, you have the first thing that we can call university. It's important to educate the soul. Today we would not consider, we would probably not vote for this guy, because he thought, actually maybe I would, because he thought you cannot have democracy. Democracy is the regime of the idiots, of the ignorance. Only philosophers should be allowed to vote, and only philosophers should be allowed to govern the people. But he's the first one to come with an ideal republic, an ideal form of society. Okay, so that's your Plato in 5 minutes. Now, as I said, Aristotle is the opposite. He believes in a world out there. It's a world, material world. It's not just a world of ideas. And you can get to know that world little by little through your senses. And nobody will ever manage to know the whole thing, but it is possible. So totally different approach. And what's the eidos that Plato was talking about? Well, it's the form of the object, yeah? But see, it's different, it's just the form, it's just the shape of the object, it's part of the object. Now, he did so many things that it's really hard to summarize, but one thing is important, is logic, syllogism. He wrote an entire thing about how can you deduct truth. If you know some facts, can you know some other facts more or less automatically? Today we have computers that do this, and computers use some of these rules. For example, if all humans are mortal and all Greeks are humans, then all Greeks are mortal is also true. there's other rules. And most of them we still use today. We still think that's valid logic. And some we don't. And of course, it cannot be that something is true and the opposite is also true. So he had this syllogism, and by putting together these rules from some truth, he could infer that there's some other truth. One truth leads to the other one, leads to the other one, and that's another way to generate knowledge. And that's exactly what the mathematicians do when they prove theorems. It was the beginning of theorem proving. Then in the science, in physics, he thought that there were 4 fundamental elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And that's all the Greek philosophy, and of course we don't believe that anymore. And then he realized there was something missing there. And the something missing was what he could see in the sky. That didn't feel like earthly stuff. So he admitted that up there must be something else. And he called it quintessence. And the other thing that he could see, it's in the next slide, but I want to do both together. And the other thing he could see is that here we tend to have lines. But up there, you tend to see circles and spheres. So he pretty much divided his physics in 2. One is here. On Earth, you have fire, water, earth, water, earth, and air. In the sky, you have quintessence, which we cannot experience because we don't live up there. On the Earth, the natural state is rest. This can is at rest. That's natural. It doesn't want to move. Okay. Centuries later, Galileo and then Newton would object to this idea. But to Aristotle, it was obvious that things, you leave them alone, they just stand there, rest. In the sky, obviously something different happens. Uniform circular motion. He knew that the sun, the moon, and so on look like they go on a circular trajectory, and it's very regular. So there was Aristotelian physics, and it was powerful for a very, very, very long time, both in the Islamic world and in the Christian world. Now about gods, and again, I prefer to use if you use the Greek word, you realize that this thing is different from Apollo and Zeus, Theos, from which theology comes. And so he said, okay, the universe is there, has always been there, will always be there, but somebody must have started the motion. This doesn't move unless somebody moves it. And once I move it, if it's another object there, that object will also move. So once you start moving things, then the universe moves. But somebody must have been the first one to move. Okay? So that's what he called the theos. There's got to be the motor that nobody moved, but he is the first one to move. The guy who started the universe at some point. So theos. And that will remain one of the proofs, logical proofs used by the church for a long time, throughout the Middle Ages. God must exist. Why? Because there must have been somebody who started the whole thing. So to summarize Greece, so out of the blue, nobody really can explain why, suddenly there's this incredible avalanche of ideas about the universe and our role within the world. As all these people try to explain the world. And initially it's more theoretical. It's just, I think it's this way, I think it's that way. I didn't list all of them, but some believe that everything's water, some believe that everything's fire, and so on. Then it becomes more logical, with people like Parmenides trying to find a logic that explains why I believe things are this way. And then you have the two big systems of Plato and Aristotle, and you can pick which one you prefer. And today we know that we tend to agree with parts of each. You know, everything's an illusion. We can only see shapes, and the only thing that really exists is ideas. Or there's a real world out there, and our senses have to struggle to figure out what's out there, but we can. Okay, it's two things, two different systems. And of course, if you believe in Aristotle thing, a lot of things happen. Mathematics, physics, so it really starts from there, and many other things. He also wrote extensively about ethics in logical terms. And in between, you have Socrates that starts moral philosophy, that starts personal philosophy, that starts discussing about how we should live our lives, not just about what's the universe like. You know, no. How are you supposed to live your life? What is right, what is wrong? What is worth living, what is not? The amazing thing, all this happened very quickly, out of the blue. It's not like Greece, like Egypt, that had been around for 5,000 years and so on. Yes. And it starts we keep saying Greece, but most of this eventually is Athens, but most of this happens in city-states. Some of them very small, not particularly rich. So that's really the miracle of the ancient Greece. And a lot of those discussions will last centuries. You know, just that then they become more experimental. But really, we are still trying to figure out what changes, you know, why things move. And if you go deep into the physics of today, we still have all those questions. So they really started asking the questions. And the answers sometimes may sound trivial, but nobody had asked those questions before. There's a point where they start asking the questions, and Western civilization is pretty much, very much about answering those questions. And then Alexander came. So Alexander was very young, 22, 24, very young. His father conquered Greece, and then Alexander went on a rampage, went all the way to India, to the Indus River, and conquered Egypt, Mesopotamia. So pretty much, so one thing that you should pay attention to, for Alexander, conquering the world meant going east. Okay? Don't forget that, because in 2 or 3 evenings we'll have a summary of the summaries, and that will be it. So the great civilizations were in that direction: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and he almost got to India. His troops mutinied. His troops decided, we've had enough, we go home. And then he died on the way back in Babylonia. So he died very young. This lasted very little. But the great thing is that his empire broke down, and a Greek general remained in charge in each of these places. So like Cleopatra, most famous of the rulers of Egypt centuries later, she was a Greek. Ptolemy was the guy who seized power in Egypt. He was one of the generals. He was a Greek. And the Seleucids, who ruled over Persia, those were the descendants of a Greek general. So the influence of Greek thought was colossal, thanks also to Alexander. And in the Mediterranean was colossal because of the Greek colonies that were already there. As I said, some of these philosophers came from southern Italy. So Greek thought not only was incredibly vibrant and, you know, explosive in many ways, revolutionary, but also had the advantage that this young man indirectly spread it over a very wide area. So that's how it fragments after his death. Those are all Greek. Those are all Greek kingdoms, actually. Like the ruling class, of course. But actually, ruling class. But then Greek was still widely spoken in this area all the way through the Arab invasion. You know, when the Arabs reached Alexandria, that's a Greek city. People speak Greek. The Gospels were written in Greek. And so.
How does the Alexander's conquest fit on the timeline of Zoroaster?
After 3 centuries later.
After, okay.
Yeah, that's a good question, because Persia really saw so many different religions. Unlike other places of the world where you can pinpoint, at some point there's a religion that prevails, that's it. Persia really went from pagan, Zoroastrian, Greek, back to Zoroastrian, and then eventually Islam. So that's called the Hellenistic Age. Hellas is Greece in Greek. Hellas, Hellenistic means this whole area that was, you want to call it colonized by Greek generals and their descendants. And that became a huge trading bloc, and as it often happens, almost always happens with huge trading blocs, that also generates a lot of flow of knowledge back and forth, and an economic boom. So those were good times for most of those places.